Business owners and IT pros, meet Norlayer, a toggle-ready, easy-to-scale security platform. Deploy secure remote access, prevent threats, and stay compliant, fast, and hardware-free across all platforms. Whether scaling or securing, Norlayer makes it simple with just a few clicks. Try risk-free with a 14-day guarantee and save up to 22% on annual plans. Visit norlayer.com/NA-nerds and use code NANERDS-10 for an extra 10% off. Don't wait. Protect your business today with Norlayer. Hello and welcome to the Network Automation Nerds podcast, where we explore the latest in network automation from a practitioner's perspective. I'm your host, Eric Cho, a network engineer who just loves everything about network automation. In today's episode, our guest really needs no introduction, but I'm going to try anyways. We have the privilege to welcome one of the only Jeff Doyle to the show today. And Jeff is a venerable expert in networking industry with over 30 years of experience as a consultant, instructor, architect, author, and speaker. And I'm quite frankly just running out of titles. Jeff's passion has taken him around the globe in regions like Japan, China, and Korea. And Jeff, I do want to talk about that terracotta warrior picture on your website at some point. In the early 2000s, Jeff was at the forefront of emerging technologies, writing and lecturing on MPLS, network consolidation. Today, his focus has shifted to the exciting realm of software-defined networking, also known as SDN, network function virtualization, large-scale fabrics, intent-based networking. Welcome to the show, Jeff.
Eric, thanks so much for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
It's such a privilege. I think for those of you who follow Jeff's podcast or his YouTube streaming, you could probably see on the back, he has like this big bookshelf, like 3 layers of bookshelves. So I think Jeff is one of those rare individuals. Instead of pointing out the books that he wrote, he might point out on the shelf that the books that he did not write or he's not co-author in and the rest of it he's written. Is that a fair statement?
I suppose, yeah. I mean, they're mostly books that, obviously other people have written. And, I've even read 1 or 2 of them. I'm a bibliophile, and so I buy more books than I ever have time to read.
Yeah, that's like me with my Udemy course. Whenever they go on the sale for like $9.99, I start putting them into my shopping cart, thinking that I would sometime in my lifetime, I would like even read or go through like the first lecture, but I never do. And it just kind of balloons like page 1 of 10 on my course list. So I guess you do that with books as well.
Yeah, and I do that with Udemy. Just like you said, I'll find, I should take this course, and I'll buy it and bookmark it. And 2 years later, I'll see another course on the same subject and buy that one and realize I had one earlier that I never got around to taking.
Not to go off subject too much, but the worst thing is when they update the course, then it's like this guilt trip that just washes over me. And it's just like, oh, you know what? Yeah, I should read that Elastic course where it was like, and that was like Elastic 6 dot something. Now it's like 8 dot and 9 dot. So it's completely outdated. And I just kind of washed that $9.99 out the toilet. But anyways, so Jeff, why don't we just talk about your professional context? Obviously, you've been in the industry for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I told you before when we met in person, you're one of my favorite authors.
Thank you.
Especially your routing TCP/IP book that was really instrumental in me when I was preparing for my CCIE. And at the time, I think that was only volume 1. I think I even emailed you to say, hey, when is volume 2 going to come out? Where we covered BGP. And obviously when it came out, I bought it and all that, but I'd already passed my CCIE. But, I kind of jealous of people who have both volumes when they were studying for the certs.
Well, it's kind of fun that, both of those volumes need a 3rd edition now. And they keep on chugging, because those basic topics don't really change that much. There's stuff to add to them. But I mean, OSPF, BGP are same technologies they've always been.
For better or for worse, right?
Yeah.
A lot of people are talking about we haven't changed that much since, I don't know, 70s or it haven't changed that much. But I would argue that it's almost surprising how well they've worked, right? I mean, yeah, you can make the point that TCP/IP has been around for a long time and it needs a refresher. But at the same time, think about how long they have been working and surprisingly still standing strong.
Yeah. And every once in a while, you hear of someone proposing some replacement for IP, or it never really goes anywhere. I mean, TCP IP is just so entrenched, and it's so much just the foundation of all data communications that, I think eventually somewhere down the road, it will be replaced by something else, but I can't foresee where that is or what that would be.
Yeah, me neither. It's just one of those things. I think as long as we keep chugging at it, then as long as it doesn't break, then we're just gonna keep on using it. So Jeff, let's go back to the beginning and talk about how did you get into technology? How did you get into network engineering? Was it love at first sight, or did you like come in from other fields? I have to say, I wasn't very familiar with your path toward technology, even though I've been following you for a long time. I don't think that's some area that you actually frequently disclose. So, I'd be interested to hear kind of that background story.
Well, it's kind of a funny story, and I actually have told it a few times.
Oh, really? Okay.
But my collegiate background is in psychology and philosophy. I had a double major in those.
Like Ross White. Nice.
Really? Oh, that's cool. This is sort of going off on a tangent already, but I wrote a thing quite some time ago just on the history of networking and within the context of a book I was writing. And I was really surprised how many psychologists are at the heart of the origins of the internet.
Hmm.
This was, back in the 50s and 60s. There were a lot of psychologists studying how the mind works and got into computers and got into the idea of computer networks, as a way of understanding how the neural networks of the mind work. And here we are kind of back at that, if you look at AI and all that sort of thing, with building neural networks that are behaving in some similar ways that neural connections are made in the human brain. None of which is what you asked about, but my brain sometimes is like a undisciplined puppy and just goes off in funny tangents. But as far as me getting into networking, I came in through a kind of weird way. Like I said, I had totally irrelevant collegiate background or educational background to networking. Going out of college, I joined the phone company. Became a phone man. I mean, I was the guy climbing poles and crawling under houses and through attics, wiring up houses for phones and all of that sort of thing. Went through a series of different things there, went on to a PBX crew, which was large business phone systems and all that. And eventually wound up, I was in New Mexico at the time, wound up on the crew that handles the company's own internal communications, for all of our offices and the call centers and all of that. And this was all handling all of that, but part of that was also handling the networks at the time,
Okay.
which were at the time were dumb IBM terminals on people's desks going back to the front end servers in closets, and then the front end servers going back to the mainframe, and kind of really different from networking that you see now. But
Hmm.
we were responsible for maintaining all of that. And it was just the beginning of having local area networks out there, and evolving to that. And I got very interested in that and kind of just began studying it. I think for our industry, having a curiosity and, being able to say, okay, this is an interesting technology, talking about buying books. I'll buy a book on this topic and read up on it and understand it. And I started that from the very beginning. And the phone company at the time, which was Mountain Bell, which became US West, which became CenturyLink, but it was Mountain Bell / US West when I was there. They created a networking group
Hmm.
that was providing frame relay and ATM services, which also meant, going out to premises and installing routers and configuring routers and that sort of thing. But it was also maintaining the frame relay and ATM switches in our central offices and all of that. And I got on that crew.
Hmm.
And that was the beginnings of what I learned. Somewhere in there, when it was US West, they started a thing called the Enterprise Networking Group and began selling networking classes. And so I became a Cisco instructor
Hmm.
through that, and it was traveling around the country teaching Cisco classes and was just absolutely loving what I was doing.
Yeah.
And so never really went back.
So when you talked about frame relay ATM, so they were primarily internal to the US West, the system. Were they selling it to enterprise at the time, or was it later?
Yeah, they were selling the services. This was for enterprise services that obviously had, many offices and that sort of thing, and were interconnecting via either frame relay or ATM.
Yeah, so that's kind of interesting because when I was talking to my old mentor at Amazon, I mean, he came from Canada, but so, Canadian Bell.
Hmm.
And, obviously, US at the time was breaking the bells into baby bells, and then the baby bells, kind of lost that centralized funding for creating, something like a university, right? So, like we talked about McDonald University. So in Canada, they had those universities where, because they were so big and they so dominant that they were able to create a internal education institute. But when the US break that down, so I was, talking to my mentor and just kind of see the evolution of where innovation was coming from. And it became apparent to us that the breakout of the baby bells was kind of the key point in the history where, because of now that one becomes five, and none of these five was dominant enough to sustain, this kind of university. And then you bring in Cisco. So now that innovation kind of shifts to the equipment vendor where they were able to have like Cisco University, such as Cisco instructors like yourself that going around and talking to students. And I would almost argue that kind of continue on today, right? Like the innovation kind of stayed with the vendors. And some would argue that it moved on to like the cloud providers, the hypervisors, that they're now having, more funding. But anyways, I want to follow back to your story. Yeah, so now you are going around the country, teaching Cisco technologies. You are loving it. How did that evolve over the years? And when did you start writing books? And how did that lead to other more exciting, oh, I don't want to say more exciting, but like, I guess later technologies?
Yeah, all of this that I was talking about getting into networking, moving out of working with telephone systems and into networking, which is not that different, was late 80s, early 90s. So, I was teaching these Cisco classes and it was teaching a few other things, taught some stuff with what was the predecessor of Bay Networks, Wellfleet, teaching some Wellfleet classes, Synopsys, some things like that.
Yeah.
But the Cisco classes at the time, there were only three classes, and that was all Cisco offered. There was intro to networking, I think.
Yes, INC something.
Yeah, yeah, something like that. There was an advanced networking class and then there was a troubleshooting class.
Mm.
And that was it. Take those three classes and you knew everything there was to know about networking, I guess.
At least for Cisco is concerned. Anyways, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, somewhere in the early 1990s, I was learning enough just from teaching these classes that I got my CCIE. Again, the only thing Cisco offered at the time, the only certification you got was CCIE. So, that, went from basics all the way up to as advanced as they could get. I thought all along I'd like to, because I enjoy writing everything from stories to technical material. And I thought I would like to write a book sometime. And there were not that many networking books around in the mid 90s, early 90s. And so I kind of planned out here's how I'm going to get to the point where I think I'll be able to, propose a book to somebody. And I'll start by writing some magazine articles.
Mhm.
And I wrote one article for Cisco World, which at the time was just a paper publication.
Yeah, for the young kids out there.
Yeah, I remember paper. Remember when that was a thing? It's like your Kindle, except it doesn't move.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. You have to like actually flip through the pages with your hands.
That's right. Again, mind that kind of works like a puppy. Our nephew told me a story a while back about his daughter picked up a family photo
Mhm.
that was just sitting in their room, and she was flipping across the glass trying to get the photo to change. So, that's the world kids are in now.
Yeah, it's like my daughter asking me, "Daddy, why do you say hang up?" Right? Like with the iPhone, right? Where do you hang this up? But anyways, it just goes back to your telephone story, right?
Or when you're in your car and somebody tells you to roll down the window.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Roll down the window. Where's that, little knob that we wrote?
Yeah. But yeah, anyway, so I wrote this one article for Cisco World on designing access lists. And this all came out of some of the classes I was teaching. There were a few things that I really had a lot of fun teaching.
Right.
And designing access lists was one of them. Subnetting was another. I actually thought I was really good at teaching subnetting and always enjoyed doing that. But anyway, wrote this article, got out of that contacted by two different publishers who said, "You want to write a book for us?" And apparently it was just in that era. And so I really just kind of stumbled into this. Publishers starting to think we need to start creating some networking books. The time has come for that. One of them was McGraw-Hill, and the other was Cisco Press, which was just a fledgling little company or publisher. They had one book on the market, which was Bassam Halabi's BGP book.
Yep, I remember that too.
And I've still got that somewhere around here. It's a classic.
Yeah, I think it's called internet routing or something like that. In routing architecture. Yeah.
And that was my favorite book. I had read it multiple times to learn BGP. And so I just thought, yeah, I'll go with Cisco Press.
Oh, instead of McGraw-Hill, because McGraw-Hill was like where college textbooks come from, right? Like that's the prestigious publisher.
Yeah, but Cisco Press had my favorite book.
Nice.
So, I said, sure, I'd love to write a book. And said, what do you want me to write about? And he said, well, whatever you want. We just need books.
That's some flexing muscle right there, Jeff. Because instead of like, "Hey, what do you want to write about?" Psh, I'm write about anything that you want.
Yeah. So I just said, well, I'll write a general book on routing as a guideline for getting your CCIE. And so that was the book. I naively proposed the book as a single book, estimating maybe 500 or 600 pages. When I got to over 1,000 pages and was not halfway through the topic, I realized this is going to have to be 2 volumes. I've watched friends do the same thing. That's one of the things I've advised a lot of people around writing books over the years. And almost always I'll see a proposal for some book and I'll look at the topic and, I'll say either you're going to hit these topics at an extremely high level or your page estimate is way too low. And it's
Mhm.
just, once you start writing and explaining things, you'll be surprised how fast you fill up those pages. But anyway, yeah, that's how I got into writing those books. The first one came out and it was popular and sort of advanced my career in other ways. I joined Juniper in the very late 90s. And when they were still a startup, I was employee number 285 there. And they had, at the time, our sales teams all over the world were dealing with engineers that would be familiar with my books. And they would say, hey, we can bring this guy in and talk to you about whatever you want to talk about. And, so I would just go in and do whatever song and dance the sales team wanted me to do. I traveled all over the world doing that. And I had a ball. And so that's kind of the long, ugly story of me just stumbling into networking from the phone company, stumbling into writing books from just happening to have my timing was right there. I stumbled into being an IPv6 quote unquote authority. I don't know what else I've stumbled into over the years.
MPLS, NFE, or SDN, and I mean you've covered all of those. Was there any challenges in shifting the hats, I would say, or what was your biggest takeaway for just learning and adapting all these different technologies? I mean, you kind of cover at the high level and just kind of casually mention, you switch from POTS, like your
Mhm.
plain old telephone company to, digital and all these technologies. I'm sure it was not as easy as you have mentioned. And so you must have your own way of learning, your maybe even failing forward, your stretch, your boundaries, and going after your comfort zone. So let's talk a little bit about that. If you just look back on in your mind, what was the biggest challenge when you're shifting from one technology to another? If there's like a technology that you have in mind, please do share.
I think the secret to all of it is having a very short attention span. I would learn something and then get very quickly interested in, okay, what's the next thing that leads to?
Hmm.
And I think the key for anybody in the industry, if they want to stay on top of things, is being constantly curious and constantly wanting to know, what's the next big thing. And being, I don't want to say constantly bored, but constantly saying, okay, I know this now, and so I don't want to just sit here and let that stagnate. I want to go to the next new thing. I guess from where I am now, primarily working with data centers, as I mentioned, I started my career with Juniper and was with them for about 10 years. And, after that was doing consultancy mainly around IPv6 and stuff like this. And everything was primarily for me focused on service provider networks. That was an exciting area. There were, that's where the big iron routers were going in. That's where, a lot of the dynamic changes in the industry were happening. A lot of the really interesting technologies, as far as large scale BGP and policies and all of that. MPLS, when that was new, all of those things were really exciting. Interestingly enough, by maybe 2010, 2011, I think a lot of those technologies were becoming old and sort of slowing down. And it's just, we had what we needed. The one exception to that was segment routing, something kind of new that was happening there. But the other side of that, data centers had always been kind of boring. It's just switches.
Hmm. Right. You got your three-layer architecture and just kind of shoe in.
Yeah, you just build your three-tier hierarchy and all of your traffic, is north-south and,
Right.
load balancers are distributing it out to wherever it needs to go. And, it just wasn't all that interesting. And all of a sudden, around 2010, 2011, at least for me, along is coming things like SDN and SD-WAN and all of these ideas around virtualization, because that was when data centers were starting to see traffic shifting, not just from north-south, but becoming east-west within data centers. And, how do you distribute that? And how does all that work? And how do you scale that? So architectures were changing and things were becoming a lot more complex. And so again, short attention span. It was like, oh, that's the next big thing there. And sort of hopped into learning about SDN and now automation, which is you and I both. That's where we saw each other face to face. The last time was at AutoCon. And
Hmm.
yeah, and there's still a lot of exciting things happening that is starting to move out of the data center back into campus and maybe into service provider beyond that. But, a lot of stuff around automation, a lot of stuff around AI now that is really fun. And, I'm scrambling as fast as I can to try to keep up with some of that technology.
I think I was talking to Phil Gervasi a few months ago, actually, and we were just talking about if everybody could just like freeze for a moment, right? Like just stop everything so I could catch up.
Yeah, exactly.
Please, everybody, just stop your development. Open AI, Sam, just go take a vacation and let's just stop there so that I could catch up so we don't feel so overwhelmed and trying to just dealing with a new thing every other week.
Things were so much easier in the 90s. You learned OSPF, you learned BGP, you learned ISIS.
Yeah.
And, maybe you go from there to MPLS, but, there wasn't that much that you had to learn. You just sort of built some deep expertise and a lot of hands-on expertise, and you could be Mr. Rockstar. But nowadays, you kind of have to pick and choose. There's so many technologies, it's impossible to understand all of them.
Are you a business owner or IT pro looking to ramp up your cybersecurity? Meet NorLayer, the toggle ready, easy to use, and scale network security platform built for modern businesses. Quickly deploy secure remote access, protect against threats, and ensure compliance, all based on zero trust with no hardware needed and work across all platforms. Whether you're scaling up or securing your system, NorLayer makes it easy to start, easy to scale, and work with the existing setup with just a few clicks. Try Norlier risk-free with a 14-day money-back guarantee and enjoy up to 22% off with annual plans. And here's the best part. Exclusive for Network Automation Nerds listeners. Visit norlayer.com/NA Nerds with code NANERDS-10. Once again, NANERDS-10 for additional 10% discount. Don't wait. Protect your business today with NordLayer. Well, speaking of technologies, Jeff, which technology excites you the most right now? I mean, I guess AI, we could probably just
Mhm.
table that a little bit and be more specific on which part of AI actually excites you. Because, I've sat through some of these. I mean, I'm in Boston right now, and I had the luxury of going into sitting in some of the graduate classes at Harvard and even at MIT. Maybe not classes per se, but just, lectures and
Mhm.
webinars and seminars. And so a lot of people are trying to see which part is going to be the emphasis. I mean, there's one estimate that, AI, because of the neural network, right? Like, so,
Yeah.
50% of the time would be IO bound and, that networking is going to be crucial. And other people have star gearing to even your NVIDIA chip is actually like a mini network in itself. So like they're trying to design algorithm that optimizes the load balancing between all these different cores on the same, I guess, DPU now, right? Or GPU, DPU, whatever you want to call that. So which area of technology really excites you right now?
Well, yeah, I mean, it is, an aspect of AI, but overall, it's where automation is going and going much beyond, what we kind of think of as automation now. People for, I don't know, 10 years or more have been talking about autonomous networks or, self-healing, self-driving networks, that sort of thing.
Right.
And I think that's where we're going to some degree.
So implicitly, you don't think we're there.
Oh, no, we're not there. I was talking to somebody about this. I can't remember who, I think just earlier this week, that if you look at the technology around self-driving cars, I really firmly believe that's our future. I actually, if you really want to upset a car nut, you can say this, which is I believe that there will come sometime in the future where it will be illegal for you to operate your car manually,
Mm.
that it's just will be unsafe.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
compared to the automation systems in a car. There'll be a day when, you can put your kids in your car and have your car take them to school. There'll be a time when blind people can own cars, and that's there. But I also believe that right now, self-driving cars are just not ready for prime time. I mean, you hear all the stuff about, mistakes that are made and all of that, but that's going to change quickly.
Hmm.
So getting back to networking, what does that have to do with networking? I think that autonomous networks are the future. And that does not mean we will not need network engineers. I think what you'll need are people that much more deeply have to understand how networks operate, which is a good thing. You're sort of this quote unquote autonomous network. It's taking away all the mundane stuff.
Hmm.
You don't have to be a CLI jockey anymore, but you do have to deeply understand what all the relationships are, within the network, all the nodes of the network, and how that works at a holistic level. But where we are right now, out of all of that, I think is partly machine learning.
Hmm.
You have to have systems that can learn the network itself, learn the behavior of the network, learn intent. With the company I've been at, intent is always a big buzzword.
That's right. Let's do that plug.
Yeah, exactly. I actually talked to a different company just very recently, and they talk about, they have an intent-based networking system too, and I really liked that. But the other piece of AI, the aspect of AI that will be essential to that is predictive AI. When you talk about useful AI nowadays, you're usually talking about generative AI.
That's right.
Write me this Python script or whatever. But there is all this money being made around predictive AI that half the time doesn't work, because where they're using it is things like, predicting who is a good credit risk, triaging patients being admitted to hospitals, looking at, who is a candidate for hiring into a job, who's a candidate for hiring or for promoting, things like that. And it's all of these programs that are based around human behavior. And humans are probably the most unpredictable and chaotic systems that you can imagine. And these things just don't work very well.
Hmm.
But networks are highly predictable. If a network is doing something it shouldn't do, it's probably a human's fault. If you just leave them alone, they mostly do what you expect them to do. And so I think that predictive AI, doing the analysis on this so that it can tell you, there's this failure and there is a 95% chance that the cause of this failure is X. Somebody
Hmm.
changed a policy in a firewall or something like that. I think that is right around the corner for automation systems. And I think that is a big step toward autonomous networking.
Yeah, that's interesting that you talked about that and you went a little deep into kind of the different models, right? So for our listeners who may not be in AI or have gone through this before, is that, we do have the foundational model who are pre-trained, but they just kind of encode this into this relationship of, numbers of relationship, right? And that's pre-trained. But mostly what we're talking about on the interfacing with the AI is the generative model, like your chat GPT or your picture generating software that's based on these foundational model. But now that we're seeing all these different cases that we're using the foundational model who are already pre-trained, that we're purposely built the generative model so that we could do other things such as prediction or correlation analysis, all of that. I think the most famous that I saw was the Google, was it like the education? I think they came out with some kind of education package so that they take the foundational model and then they, on top of it, do a generative model, but it's very much geared toward education, like K through 12,
Mhm.
so that they take out all the bad words and they, kind of appropriate some of the other things that, maybe it's a little bit harmful to a younger mind. You could argue the ethnicity of that. However, it is, going toward this trend of purpose built. So you do think that kind of this correlation and this next stage of AI is what most excites you right now?
Yeah, like I said, the predictive as opposed to generative is, I think that's next stage.
Yeah. And you also go back to a bigger bubble of like machine learning, right? So it's not just natural language processing, AI, and all that.
Yeah, and that's just the processes underlying all of this. So
Absolutely. If that's the direction that we're going, where do you see the network engineer kind of moving in the next 5 years, right? Or 5 years may even be too long. So let's just say 2 years, right? 1 year, 2 year. If you're, mid-range network engineer, maybe you've been working in, the industry for about 5, 10 years. You have your NPIE under your belt.
Hmm.
And now that it's like I'm hearing all these news about I'm going to be replaced by AI, or like before then it was like a Python script, but now it's AI, right?
Yeah.
So, what would you recommend the person go do next, right? Like, go learn this. And if I too have a short attention span, where would Jeff recommend me go next?
I think you still have to learn the underlying technologies.
Okay.
All that AI is doing is the things that can be done a lot faster, the things computers do well, things that can be done a lot faster than a human could do, which is things like data analysis, information retrieval and all of that sort of thing. When things break, there still has to be somebody that understands what the foundations of that network are built on.
Right.
So the protocols you've been learning in the past are still important to know. I do think that it's important to learn at least the basics of AI, really machine learning. For that reason, to understand what those systems are doing on the surface for your network, so probably, people are going to need a bit more math background.
Okay.
I had to kind of struggle and brush off all of my math books when I started learning a lot more about machine learning and deep learning and all of that. And you don't really have to be an expert there. It's hard to understand much of it unless you understand some of the underlying math. You don't have to be an expert in that math. But when you talk about things like Bayesian statistics and all of that, at least know what that is. So that's important, and I guess, what's beyond that is, the idea of data analytics, just getting a grasp of what the technologies are or what the foundations of, what these AI systems are built around,
Yeah.
and what are the challenges that it's going to present to you.
That's the tough part, Jeff. I think, that I face and as well as other people have faced is that I think, if we're just looking at, yeah, obviously the foundations and we could learn the basics, that even going down to math, right? English,
Mhm.
math, and all these macro skills that it's applicable to any field that you go into. And then we go on top of that and say we learn the networking fundamentals. But beyond that, it's very hard to go from, say, just learning the basics into be able to troubleshoot when something breaks.
Exactly.
I'll give you an example is that, I was using AI, I was using Copilot to write out some scripts that allow me to talk to Elasticsearch. And I was able to correct the script and help me be more productive because I banged my head against, talking to Elasticsearch for about 5 or 6 years in my previous position. And so I was able to identify, what Copilot was giving me the right information about.
Mhm.
And what I thought was, how does a person who did not spend those 5 years, which is, like other people who's coming into this field right now, to deal with that, right? Like, so I think it's almost like it's easy for people to getting into the industry right now because you're coming into, I guess, AI native. Now people
Yeah.
say they're mobile native, right? They're AI native, so they're kind of either clean plate. And the senior people who already have these wealth of information that's helping them to be more productive, but that messy middle, I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. But that is the area where I think how do we use AI or any other tools, machine learning, to teach people from going from just the basics and bring them into an expert level so fast so that they could troubleshoot. I mean, when I retired or something, right? Like the next wave needs to come in and do the same thing that I need to do right now.
I think it goes back to what we said back at the beginning of our conversation of being constantly curious and don't sit on your laurels. Don't think, okay, I learned this. And so now I'm a networking guru and I don't need to know anything else. It's funny how many people tell me, like you did, I used your books to get into networking and really, and it's like most of the people that are telling me that, I look and it's like, oh gosh, these people are way smarter than I am.
You're being too humble.
Not at all. It's just there are people like you that are, aggressive in what they're learning. And, I really appreciate that maybe my books help, people like you kick off your career, but it's like, oh, you've gone way beyond me now. But at the same time, it's important to just keep up and, be constantly studying.
nowadays, how do you learn? And I'm curious because I didn't know you had a psychology background, right? So was that helpful in you to understand your own psychic and how you learn how to learn? That's almost a science in itself, right? So
Yeah.
I'm curious myself, but how do I go to the next step and learn that new technology and become a guru or semi-guru?
It's just to say something about the whole psychology thing.
Sure.
I started off with an interest in philosophy and I thought, oh, I'd love to be a philosophy professor. And somewhere after I had invested a lot of my college career in studying philosophy, and which I still love, I sat down with one of my professors and he said, well, that's a great ambition, but just so you know, there's probably a couple of thousand people with doctorates in philosophy and, maybe six openings in universities for teaching philosophy.
Right. The hiring cycle is a little mismatched.
Yeah, yeah. So, I had done a little psychology, so got into that, thought, oh, it might be fun to be a psychologist. I wanted to be a research psychologist. I had a major professor who was an experimental psychologist and used to love Dr. Barry Goldson was his name. He used to love saying psychology as a science is about where surgery was in the 14th century. And the whole idea of experimental psychology is trying to turn it more into a science. So anyway, I was interested in that, but like I said, took a break after I got my 4-year degree, and then you buy a car, and the phone company was supposed to be just to, make some money before I go back to school.
Just paid the bills. Yeah.
Yeah, you go into debt and all of a sudden, it's a job
Right.
or a career. But anyway, as far as where all of this goes, I think as far as how that influences learning, I was surprised working for a consultancy and talking to network consultants, how many of them had liberal arts degrees as opposed to computer science degrees. And, whether some of that was, okay, well, I went into networking because you can't make a living with a liberal arts degree.
Maybe not a very good one.
But I also think that that background, that educational background, makes people think outside of the box more. And you're not just looking at the limits of what a technology is doing, you're looking at where it'll go. And I think that really helps in terms of learning and that sort of thing. But the other part of your question, which I just jabbered on, and as far as you were talking about, how does that help you?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I absolutely agree with what you said about being broad and being curious, even for other fields. So you talked about, being philosophy and then psychology. And I too, I mean, shout out to Adam Grant, where I was at his talk last night and for Hidden Potential, author of Hidden Potential and Originals. And, I'm a big fan of James Clear. I'm a big fan of Malcolm Gladwell. So all of them really are kind of psychology practice with practical advices for people. So I absolutely identify with the fact that, if you have quote unquote liberal arts that help you think outside of the box and help you understand yourself. So that's part of my question is trying to see if, you actually was able to apply some of those concepts into your learning. And I think you answered that. And I think the previous question I had was, once you have that, how do we bridge the gap or how do we use those experience and knowledge that we've had to quickly bridge the gap between going from just like, I
Mhm.
guess, mid-level to an expert?
I think going back to something I said a little bit earlier, you have to choose the area that interests you. You can't just be a networking generalist anymore. I mean, you can if you're just wanting to be the IT guy at a mid-sized company or whatever, you can probably, but if you really want to have an interesting career in networking, you're going to have to pick an area that interests you and chase that, while at the same time understanding enough about the other aspects of networking, and how they influence what you're chasing. So, I'm interested in automation, but, I also have to understand enough about security. I will tell people I know next to nothing about network security, but I know enough of the basics to know how that influences what I'm doing and where the considerations are there. And so it's just a matter of chasing your interests and deciding what those are. And that may be a hard thing to do. And also knowing and acknowledging that, it's possible that you could go a little way down that road and decide that's not what I'm interested in after all and jump over to a different ladder.
I am very pleasantly surprised that you said that to pick, kind of your specialization because I think I talked to a lot of network engineer and well, part of the reason they pick network engineer is because of their personality who wants to understand how end-to-end works. And I think, if you talk about programming, coding, you already like 5 layers abstracted away from the hardware, right?
Yeah.
By the time you touch like that hello world for Python. But for networking, it was one of those rare area that you could still kind of get it from layer one on your, plug in that cable or, swap that fiber, whatever, and all the way up to the TCP level. And so a lot of people got into this field. They're so used to being able to be like the superhero who understands everything. It's a little bit hard for them, especially for mid-career, to know that I have to pick a specialization. Maybe I just have to do container networking or Kubernetes networking or just Python or whatever that X would be. And I really enjoy that answer because coming from you, who to me is very broad and very deep on multiple technologies, that you're saying that answer. So it gives permission to the rest of us to say, it's okay to not know ABC as long as you focus on Z or something like that.
I may be saying this just because it was kind of my own experience, my own path, and others may disagree. But, at some point, you were talking about mid career or whatever. I think it's very useful to go into consulting of some sort because if you work for one company, you may get to know that networking intimately, and you may be the guy at that network that knows everything about it, knows what's going on. But no two networks are the same. And there's so many things that may be happening outside of that network that you're not learning anything about. Whereas with consulting, you're popping from one network operator to another. And, just about the time you kind of get to know one network, you're done with that job and you're going off and having to learn a completely different network and, a different corporate style for operating that network and, the whole bit. And it gives you a very diverse and broad perspective on the industry, I think. And you could still do that, obviously, within a specialization. You probably have to do it within a specialization.
Yeah. I think back to what you were talking about on why service provider was the most interesting and challenging for network engineers, right? Because, like you said, the enterprises usually have their network set up and it's kind of just keeping the lights on afterwards. But for a service provider, you actually go from network to network and, the technology is their core competency. So they do have to be the expert in it and offer that expertise to their customers. So they're willing to invest in the technology, the knowledge, the training for other people development. And so bring that back to what you're talking about being consultants, then you have these broad exposure. And now that I'm with, Network to Code and we're very much a professional services, I get what you're talking about. And I will also add to that, besides the technology, you also understand more about the business aspect of it, on,
Yeah.
not just I think technology is probably at best 60%. The 40% is actually how to deal with people, not being a jerk and kind of communicate your point without offense or, maybe somebody sitting across the table doesn't have the same beliefs as you. And I'm not just talking about technology, right? Religion or, any other hot topics, but you're still able to be focused and talk about the issue at hand and be collaborative and operate at a professional level. Those are the ones that really bubble up as a skill set for a consultant. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, I agree. And I like the fact that you kind of generalized that because I think that's just kind of a life skill as much as, a skill in our industry is just be a nice guy and, don't have an ego. I kind of have always approached, if I'm in a meeting with a lot of new people, new customers or whatever, I just kind of always assume that everybody else in the room is smarter than I am. And it really helps to keep your ego in check and be nice to the younger people, be a mentor. I think that's important too. And also just see what other people have to offer for you to learn. People are always a lot more open to help you if you're nice to them. All right, we're sort of going off into mushy areas here, but
No, no, it's all good. It's all good, Jeff. I mean, that's a difference between you and I. You assume everybody else in the room is smarter than you. I don't have to assume. I know so. so,
well,
so hey, no problem. I don't even have to pretend, right? I know there's always somebody who I could learn to. So, and you're a likable guy, Jeff. That's why they've even back in the 90s, they fly you all over the world to talk to people, right? You can't do that unless you're super nice and approachable. I really enjoyed our conversation today, Jeff. I appreciate you being here. Can you just tell people where they can find you if they want to follow more of your work, besides the, I don't know, tens of hundreds of books that you've authored? Exaggerating, of course.
Well, I've got a website that's kind of stagnant right now. I need to get back to writing more blogs on that. It comes from when I had my own consultancy. The name is still there, which is www.doyleassociates.net.
Hmm.
And you can still find some blogs there that, like I said, I really need to write some more of them.
That's where I saw the Terracotta Warrior picture, by the way. I have that link in the show notes.
Yeah, yeah. That's one of my favorite pictures.
Yeah, where else could people find you?
Probably the other place is Between Two Nerds,
Yes,
which you were kind enough to be a guest.
it was my pleasure.
I think you were the guest in the last show we did, in fact. But Jeff Tansura at NVIDIA and myself do Between Two Nerds, and it's very much like this show, just casual conversation about what's going on in the industry. And we publish every episode to YouTube, so you can look on YouTube and you can find us there talking about pretty much some aspect of data center, it seems like, although we do expand from that and, talk more broadly about BGP and all of that sort of thing. So
It's not just AI all day, all the time.
we don't talk that much. I don't think either one of us really know what we're talking about half the time on AI. So we talk about other topics.
I don't know. Jeff T now works for NVIDIA, right? So even if he doesn't know, he's going to know it pretty fast.
That's right. That guy is, speaking of people that are way smarter than I am, he's certainly one of them.
For me too, for sure. But you're probably just right on that same level. Anyways, Jeff is not hard to find. Just click on any of the show notes. And even if you just do a search engine, just look him up, not hard to find. And again, thank you, Jeff, for being here. I really appreciate our conversation. And I'm sure our listeners really benefit from all of your wisdoms.
Well, Eric, thanks for inviting me. This has been a fun conversation. I hope we do it again sometime soon.
Absolutely. That's exactly what I said to you, Alacon, when we bump into the whole week. I was like, you have this open invitation. Whenever you can make it, just give me a ping. So yeah, definitely we'll be back to the show at some point and we'll chat more. And, I don't know if we did any predictions, maybe the self-driving car. So maybe we'll see, at some point that prediction come true.
Yeah, I sort of stuck my neck way out there in making those predictions, but we'll see.
That's a safe bet. Thanks again.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Network Automation Nerds. Do you have any feedbacks for Network Automation, our guest Jeff today, or this episode itself? Send us some follow-ups at packetpushers.net/follow-up. We want to hear from you, our listeners. Check out our websites at packetpushers.net to find other network engineering focused podcasts, blogs, YouTube videos, lessons, and so much more. You can find podcasts such as Network Break for network weekly news, Heavy Networking for deep dives into a technology, Packet Protector for security, and is for networking for newcomers, and so much more. We thank you, the wonderful listeners, for your support. Last but not least, remember that too much network automation will never be enough.